What if the most powerful man in the world, the architect of global peace, was slowly being poisoned by his own ambition, his body crumbling under a silent, invisible assassin? For President Woodrow Wilson in 1919, the fight to save the world was rapidly killing the man who dared to lead it. By early 1919, Woodrow Wilson stood at a pinnacle of global influence unmatched by any American leader before him. He was no longer merely the President of the United States. He was widely regarded, particularly in Europe, as the savior of civilization. His 14 points, a blueprint for global peace and self-determination, had ended the carnage of the Great War and ushered in a fervent, almost utopian hope for a new world order. Wilson was an intellectual, a former university president known for his sharp mind and moral rectitude. He approached international politics not as a game of mere power, but as a moral crusade. His greatest, most cherished creation was the League of Nations, envisioned as a permanent covenant where nations would settle disputes through dialogue, not slaughter. This league was, in his mind, the crowning achievement of his life, the ultimate justification for America's entry into the European conflict, and the only safeguard against future global destruction. Wilson returned to America not to rest, but to face his fiercest political enemy, his own Republican-controlled Senate. Led by the formidable Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, a bitter intellectual rival, the Senate viewed the League of Nations not as a moral imperative, but as a fatal entanglement that would strip the United States of its sovereignty and pull American boys into endless foreign wars. Lodge and the irreconcilables were determined to defeat the Treaty of Versailles and bury the League. The president, fiercely proud and unwilling to compromise on the treaty's core principles, refused to stay and negotiate with his foes in Washington. Instead, he made a decision born of sheer stubbornist idealism. He would bypass the political machinery entirely and appealed directly to the American people. He believed, with the fervor of a preacher, that if the citizens truly understood the moral necessity of the League, they would compel their senators to vote for ratification.
In 1919, Wilson embarked on a grueling, unprecedented national whistle-stop tour. This was no pleasure trip. It was a 3-week, 8,000-mile odyssey across the American heartland. The tour was an unrelenting physical drain. The presidential train, the Mayflower, sliced through the vast country. Day after day, Wilson delivered the same fervent speech, sometimes 4 times a day, often speaking without the aid of modern amplification in crowded, sweltering halls. The schedule was brutal. Morning, early start, frantic preparation of notes. Midday, a rushed appearance and speech in one city, followed by a frantic dash back to the train. Afternoon, travel, interrupted by brief stops where he would speak from the rear platform of the Mayflower. Evening, the main event, a fiery 2-hour address to thousands, often ending with Wilson visibly perspiring and trembling. He barely slept, ate poorly, and relied on sheer willpower and nervous energy to sustain his momentum. The strain was immediately apparent to those closest to him. His closest aides, including his physician, Admiral Cary T. Grayson, watched with mounting terror as the president's body began to show alarming signs of physical distress. A body betrayed. The history of the hidden weakness. The strain of 1919 was not attacking a healthy man. It was attacking a body with the history of vulnerability. For years, Wilson had been quietly battling severe, potentially life-threatening health issues that were carefully concealed from the public, even from many in his own administration. Crucially, Wilson was a known victim of arteriosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries, and had a long struggle with hypertension, or dangerously high blood pressure. More frighteningly, Wilson had already suffered several minor strokes, cerebral incidents. The most notable occurred in 1906, while he was the president of Princeton University. This event briefly blinded him in his left eye, a fact that was kept secret and dismissed as neuritis, or a nerve inflammation. This earlier stroke provided a chilling precedent. Wilson's body had already shown its tendency to fail under pressure, and his instinct was to hide the weakness. In the weeks leading up to the final collapse in 1919, the signs of impending disaster were everywhere for those who chose to see them. Severe headaches. Wilson complained of blinding, debilitating headaches. Physical tremors. His left arm and leg often showed uncontrolled twitching or minor paralysis, which he attempted to disguise. Failing vision. He experienced persistent double vision and difficulty reading his own prepared texts. Rage and irritability. His temperament, usually cool and measured, grew volatile. He became intensely stubborn and prone to sudden, disproportionate fits of anger, classic neurological warning signs. Admiral Grayson, his physician and closest confidant, repeatedly pleaded with him to stop the tour. Grayson warned the president that he was risking his life, but Wilson was deaf to the warnings. "I can no longer postpone the sacrifice. Better lose my life than lose the League." He saw the fight as a necessary martyrdom, but his body was preparing to issue a final, brutal ultimatum. The stage was set. A nation divided, a world desperate for peace, and a brilliant man whose pride and idealism had pushed him past the breaking point, setting the scene for a catastrophic political and medical cover-up that would leave the nation and the world wondering who was truly in charge. The national tour commenced in September 1919. It was less a political tour, more an act of desperate martyrdom. Woodrow Wilson, against the impassioned pleas of his wife Edith Wilson and his personal physician Admiral Carey T. Grayson, climbed aboard the presidential train, determined to ignite the national conscience. The tour was a deliberate, brutal act of self-exhaustion. The goal was to cover the maximum ground in the shortest time, targeting the Midwestern and Western states where Senate opposition to the League of Nations was strongest. Wilson's routine was punishing, designed to break even a young, healthy man. 10,000 miles in 22 days. The train, the Mayflower, rarely stopped. The president was perpetually jolted and sleepless, traveling thousands of miles away from the quiet confines of the executive mansion. The podium was the battlefield. Wilson delivered approximately 40 major speeches and dozens of rear platform addresses. In crowded, poorly ventilated auditoriums across cities like Omaha, St. Louis, and San Francisco, he spoke with the intense, almost manic fervor of a man possessed. His voice, naturally powerful, was strained to the breaking point. He didn't just advocate for the League, he preached its divine necessity.
The declining spectacle. Initially, the crowds were skeptical but respectful. By the time Wilson reached the West Coast, however, his charisma was replaced by palpable desperation. He was physically wearing out before the eyes of the American public. For those traveling on the Mayflower, Wilson's deteriorating physical state was impossible to ignore. The meticulous, scholarly president was dissolving under the strain, exhibiting classic symptoms of severe stress complicated by his chronic hypertension and arteriosclerosis. The constant headache. He began to complain constantly of splitting, blinding headaches. These were not simple migraines, they were severe neurological episodes that forced him to occasionally halt discussions or lie down in his compartment. The facial tics and tremors. A noticeable, uncontrolled twitching began in the left side of his face. He frequently struggled to manage the left side of his mouth and experienced difficulty speaking clearly, signs which Dr. Grayson desperately tried to attribute to nervous fatigue. The unchecked anger. Wilson's famed self-control vanished. He became fiercely irritable and prone to explosive rages over trivial details. His interactions with staff were sharp and accusatory. This personality shift, a strong indicator of cerebral distress, terrified his aides, who had never seen the president so volatile. Disguised weakness. The most alarming signs involved his motor skills. He struggled to use his left hand to hold papers and would favor his right side while walking, attempting to subtly mask a developing gait impairment. Edith Wilson, ever vigilant, began standing closer to him on the platform steps, ready to catch him if he fell. On September 25, 1919, in Pueblo, Colorado, Wilson delivered what would become his final impassioned public address. It was considered one of the greatest speeches of his life, a plea for peace that left the audience in tears. But immediately afterward, the body gave out. As the train pulled away, Wilson felt an uncontrollable, severe spasm of pain. Admiral Grayson stepped in immediately. Examining the president, he found his pulse erratic and his blood pressure dangerously high. The journey was immediately canceled. Wilson was rushed back to Washington, D.C. He had survived the tour, but the damage was irreversible. President Wilson returned to the White House on September 28, 1919. He was utterly spent, but alive. Edith put him to bed immediately, determined to enforce the rest he had so violently resisted. 4 days later, on the morning of Thursday, October 2, 1919, the catastrophic event occurred. Wilson awoke feeling disoriented and weak. He attempted to move from his bed, but his body betrayed him. As he struggled, he collapsed partially onto the floor. Edith Wilson rushed to his side and, with the help of a maid, managed to get him back into bed. The consequences were immediate and terrifying. Paralysis. The entire left side of his body was paralyzed. His left arm and left leg were lifeless, confirming a massive cerebral vascular accident, stroke. Impaired vision. The vision in his left eye was severely affected. Cognitive damage. While conscious and able to speak, his cognitive abilities were seriously impaired, particularly his judgment and attention span. Within hours, the crisis was sealed behind the high walls of the White House residence. The initial panic was palpable, but quickly replaced by an ironclad pact of secrecy orchestrated by two people, Edith Wilson and Admiral Grayson. The medical lockdown. Dr. Grayson called in medical consultants, but only on a strict understanding that they would reveal nothing. He issued a simple, misleading statement to the public. The president was suffering from nervous exhaustion, indigestion, and a complete breakdown. The word stroke was strictly forbidden. The seclusion chamber. Wilson was confined to his second-floor bedroom. The room effectively became the center of the executive branch and its tomb. Aides were told the president was too busy and too weak to see visitors. The cabinet in the dark. Vice President Thomas Marshall, the legal next in line for the presidency, was deliberately kept uninformed of the true severity of the situation. Secretary of State Lansing attempted to call a meeting of the cabinet to discuss the possibility of invoking the constitutional protocols for presidential disability, a process that didn't yet formally exist as the 25th Amendment. But Edith Wilson and Grayson blocked the move, fearing it would expose the president's permanent incapacity. The White House transformed into a stage for the greatest deception in modern American politics. Edith Wilson took full, unprecedented control. The gatekeeper. Every piece of correspondence, every cabinet memorandum, every legislative bill, and every diplomatic cable was first screened by Edith. She was the sole decider of what Wilson was mentally capable of seeing or processing. The scriptwriter. If a response was required, Edith would paraphrase the document for her husband. Often, she would simply issue responses based on her perceived understanding of his wishes, later famously stating, "I studied every paper. I simply dared not to bother him with things that were not vital."
Behind the elegant marble and plaster walls, the most powerful government on earth was being run by a first lady and a doctor, all while the man constitutionally charged with the office lay partially paralyzed, his mind shrouded in secrecy and pain. The nation believed its president was simply tired. The true, terrifying reality was that the White House had effectively ceased to function as a republic, replaced by an unofficial, hidden regency. The White House, usually a loud engine of democracy, had fallen silent. The heavy double doors of the president's second-floor bedroom were now the ultimate boundary of power, a boundary guarded by a fierce, loyal sentry, Edith Bowling Galt Wilson. The quiet panic of October 2, 1919 quickly hardened into an iron will to deceive. The decision to conceal the truth was not born purely out of personal loyalty. It was framed by Edith Wilson and Admiral Carey T. Grayson as a desperate act of civic duty. The reasoning was brutally simple, mirroring the calculations made during Grover Cleveland's crisis. Preventing financial panic. Just 6 months after the war, the economy was turbulent. Announcing that the president was paralyzed would cause widespread panic, destabilize the markets, and invite opportunistic foreign powers to test America's resolve. Maintaining foreign policy momentum. The League of Nations was still fighting for its life in the Senate. Acknowledging Wilson's incapacity would hand his enemy, Henry Cabot Lodge, the ammunition he needed to declare the treaty dead and bury the League forever. With no clear mechanism for presidential disability, the 25th Amendment wouldn't exist for another half-century. The transfer of power to Vice President Thomas Marshall was fraught with peril. Marshall was largely seen by Wilson's inner circle as incapable and lacking the vision to protect the League. Admiral Grayson authored the official soothing medical bulletins that were utter fabrications. He reported nervous exhaustion, a severe digestive disturbance, and a need for absolute rest. No one outside that locked bedroom heard the word stroke. Imagine the hushed corridors of the White House, the rustle of papers as Edith Wilson decided which matters of state were important enough to bother her husband. She became the shadow president, the filter through which all information passed. The White House residence transformed into a fortress of selective information. Access to the president was entirely cut off, and all incoming communications were funneled through the formidable intelligence and loyalty of the First Lady. The treaty drafts to routine bills was delivered to Edith. She would read it, assess its content, and make a solitary political decision. These she would gently summarize for the heavily medicated and often confused president. His response would be vague, perhaps a mumbled yes or no, which Edith would then translate back into official executive language. These, comprising the bulk of daily executive work, she would either file away, return to the department with a note saying the president had taken care of it, or sometimes, daringly, act upon herself in his implied voice. Controlling the narrative. Aides, cabinet members, and ambassadors were granted audience only with her. They were told the president was working from his bed, resting, or making progress. The rare individuals permitted a glimpse of Wilson were heavily coached beforehand. The room was carefully staged, and the president was often propped up by pillows to conceal the paralysis on his left side. The unofficial private secretary. For 17 months, Edith Wilson served as the unofficial chief of staff, secretary of state, and personal nurse. She did not merely tend to her husband's comfort. She actively managed the business of the United States government. She later defended her actions. I myself never made a single decision regarding the disposition of public affairs. The only decision that was mine was what was important and when to present them. The secrecy within the White House was maintained because the most powerful men in the country, the cabinet, chose complicity over crisis. Secretary of State Robert Lansing, deeply troubled by the lack of leadership and the stalled League of Nations process, finally attempted to push for action. He suggested that the cabinet should formally investigate the president's disability. Edith Wilson's response was swift and definitive. She effectively banished Lansing from the inner circle, viewing him as a traitor. When Wilson eventually recovered enough to comprehend the matter, Edith convinced him to summarily fire Lansing for daring to question the functionality of the presidency.
The vice president, Thomas Marshall, was perhaps the most tragic figure. He was so deliberately isolated that he didn't even know the nature of the crisis.
Marshall, remembering the bitter division caused by previous presidential power transfers, famously refused to be seen as reaching for power, stating, "I could not steal the office." Lacking concrete medical evidence and fearing a political bloodbath, he and the rest of the cabinet remained silent, effectively sanctioning the regency of Edith Wilson. The most devastating political consequence unfolded in the Senate. Wilson's paralysis struck at the very moment when his persuasive power was needed most. The League of Nations was defeated not by a single vote, but by a creeping paralysis of leadership. No compromise. Senator Lodge was willing to pass the treaty if certain reservations were added. The paralyzed Wilson, isolated and reliant on his wife's translation of the political landscape, issued rigid instructions: accept the treaty as written or not at all. Edith, perhaps reflecting her own contempt for Lodge, strongly supported this uncompromising stance. The nation required Wilson's famous oratory and his ability to lobby senators one-on-one. This charismatic force was now trapped in a silent room. With no president to rally public opinion or broker a deal, the momentum died. The Senate formally rejected the Treaty of Versailles in November 1919 and again in March 1920. The dream of the League of Nations, Wilson's legacy, perished not on the battlefield, but in the hushed, secretive halls of the White House, killed by a stroke and the political machinations of a deeply devoted wife. For 17 months, the government of the United States operated under an unprecedented veil of deception. Edith Wilson would later refer to her role not as running the country, but as performing a stewardship. She maintained that she was merely ensuring the sick man's wishes were carried out, filtering the overwhelming torrent of daily affairs. The stroke had done its catastrophic work. In the quiet sanctuary of the White House residence, the executive branch of the United States government did not cease to function. Rather, it was functionally hijacked, not by an enemy, but by loyalty, fear, and a desperate sense of duty. Following October 2, 1919, the second floor of the White House became the operational center of the American Republic. Yet it felt more like a medieval monastery. The atmosphere was one of perpetual, suffocating silence. Aides walked on tiptoe, telephones were muted, and the natural, vibrant noise of governance evaporated. This deliberate quiet was essential to the deception. A healthy presidency is loud and visible. A sick one must be silent and unseen. The entire apparatus of state, which usually moved through a complex network of secretaries, agencies, and cabinet departments, now flowed toward one single indispensable human filter: First Lady Edith Wilson. Imagine the hushed corridors of the White House, the rustle of papers as Edith Wilson decided which matters of state were important enough to bother her husband. She became the shadow president, the filter through which all information passed. This was not a simple act of a devoted nurse. It was a political strategy executed with chilling precision. Edith Wilson developed an unprecedented system for handling the daily deluge of executive responsibilities. The most effective tool in the cover-up was absolute control over access. No one, not cabinet secretaries, not congressmen, and certainly not the press, was allowed a direct, unmonitored meeting with the president. The screening process. Every visitor had to submit a written request to Edith, detailing exactly the nature of their business. If Edith deemed the matter trivial or too controversial for the president's fragile state, the visitor was immediately turned away with a polite, firm denial. When a cabinet secretary absolutely insisted on receiving direct presidential instruction, often because a major piece of legislation required it, Edith would employ a careful strategy. The official would be brought up, allowed a brief, staged conversation with Wilson, who was heavily propped up and coached by Admiral Grayson, and then dismissed. The official would leave believing the president had grasped the issue, when in reality Wilson was often distracted, irritable, or simply too exhausted to process complex details.
Aides as actors. All staff were sworn to secrecy. They had to maintain the illusion that the president was merely resting or working from his bed. The few who saw the reality of the stroke, the paralyzed left side, the difficulty speaking, the periods of mental fog, knew that exposure meant political ruin, not only for the Wilsons, but potentially for the country. The literal business of running the country, signing bills, issuing executive orders, and responding to diplomatic crises depended entirely on Edith's interpretation of her husband's will. The summary and the spin. Documents arrived at the White House in large volumes. Edith read them all. She would then prepare simplified summaries of the truly critical issues. These summaries were often biased toward her own firmly held political views, especially concerning the League of Nations. The approval of a nod. When presenting a paper to Wilson, she would gently guide the conversation, asking him if he approved of the measure. Given his limited capacity, his responses were often simple affirmations, a weak nod, a mumbled yes, or a slight squeeze of her hand. Edith then took this minimal gesture and transformed it back into a powerful, clear executive command.
While Edith claimed she never signed his name, the issue of his signature itself was fraught. Due to the paralysis in his left hand, Wilson struggled to write. For official documents, his signature was often applied with a rubber stamp, or, in some cases, guided by Edith's assistants until his hand was steady enough to manage a shaky scribble. The question remains, how many documents did he truly comprehend before approving with a near illegible scrawl? The greatest political vulnerability lay with Vice President Thomas Marshall. According to the unwritten protocols of the time, if the president was deemed unable to perform his duties, the vice president was expected to step in. Marshall was deliberately, expertly kept ignorant of the true severity of the president's condition. While he knew Wilson was ill, he did not know he was paralyzed and cognitively impaired. Marshall was a man known for his self-deprecating humor. He famously joked, "I wish they would show me the corpse. I don't know what is going on. They won't let me see the patient." Marshall's inaction stemmed from a legitimate fear of provoking a full-blown civil war among the branches of government. He felt he lacked the constitutional authority and the political support to simply declare Wilson incapacitated. He understood that if he acted, and Wilson later recovered, even partially, Marshall would be forever branded a usurper, a title he desperately wished to avoid. Marshall was not alone. The cabinet, fearful of Edith's power and uncertain of Marshall's leadership, chose stability over honesty. They refused to band together and confront the First Lady, thereby allowing the secret presidency to continue unchallenged. For over a year, Edith Wilson performed executive functions that by any definition qualify her as the de facto acting president. She made appointments, dismissed a troublesome Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, and dictated foreign policy strategy. She created an unprecedented regency that operated entirely outside the constitutional framework. The quiet, behind-the-scenes drama that unfolded in those months was a masterclass in political maneuvering, all while the American public was assured that their leader was simply resting. The hushed efficiency of the White House concealed a profound constitutional and political vacuum, ensuring that the greatest secret in presidential history remained a whisper behind locked doors, known only to those who dared not speak it aloud. The secret presidency of Edith Wilson lasted until the spring of 1920. But even the most tightly woven web of deception eventually begins to fray. Slowly, painfully, the truth began to leak out. The sustained absence of the president became impossible to ignore. Though Admiral Grayson continued to issue misleading bulletins, the sheer lack of executive visibility, the canceled meetings, the absence of public speeches, the silence spoke louder than any prepared statement. In December 1919, two skeptical senators, Republican Albert B. Fall and Democrat Gilbert Hitchcock, were finally permitted to visit the president.
This was a direct political attempt to administer a kind of layman's cognitive test. Wilson, propped up in his bed, his left side carefully concealed beneath a blanket, managed to appear lucid and coherent, albeit frail. They reported that his mind was clear as a bell, a finding that momentarily quieted the most persistent rumors, but only served to prove the skill of Edith Wilson's staging. By February 1920, the press began reporting the word stroke. By the time Wilson appeared in public, usually in a carefully managed event on the White House portico or being driven in a carriage, the evidence of his physical decline was undeniable. He was a shadow of the vibrant, powerful orator who had left for Europe a year earlier. Wilson remained in office, technically functional, but politically and physically a broken man. He clung to the dignity of his office, his chief motivation being a stubborn refusal to let his enemies feel they had forced him out. He survived the remainder of his term, walking away from the White House in March 1921, an invalid, never having achieved the American ratification of his beloved League of Nations. The man who had sought to bring eternal peace to the world departed in quiet failure, his physical collapse directly contributing to the political collapse of his most cherished dream. The enduring legacy of the Wilson presidency was not just the defeat of a treaty, but the terrifying realization that the Constitution had failed. For 17 months, the government had stumbled forward under a cloud of uncertainty. The crucial questions, raised but never answered, hung over the republic. Who decides if a president is disabled? How is the power transferred to the vice president? And how does the president get the power back? The original language of the Constitution was fatally vague, merely stating that in case of the president's inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president. This ambiguity left a massive gaping hole in the structure of the American government, a hole that had been temporarily and dangerously filled by the discretion of a doctor and a deeply devoted wife. The Wilson crisis was not an anomaly. It followed similar episodes with Presidents William Henry Harrison, James Garfield, and Grover Cleveland. The near disasters of the 19th and early 20th centuries proved that the United States had no mechanism to deal with a president who was alive, but incapacitated. The shock of the Wilson and decades later the Eisenhower health crises, combined with the vacancy left in the vice presidency after John F. Kennedy's assassination in 1963, finally forced Congress to act. They realized that the nation could not afford another secretive, constitutionally questionable regency. The direct answer to the crisis created by Woodrow Wilson's stroke and Edith Wilson's cover-up arrived decades later with the ratification of the 25th Amendment to the Constitution in 1967. This amendment, in many ways, is the political epitaph to the Wilson presidency. It provided clearly and definitively the missing constitutional framework. Section 3 allows the president to voluntarily step aside temporarily, as used later by Presidents Reagan and George W. Bush. Section 4 crucially addresses the Wilson scenario. It establishes a clear formal process for the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to declare the president unable to perform his duties, immediately making the vice president the acting president. This process, the one that Thomas Marshall and the cabinet dared not invoke in 1919, was formalized to ensure that never again could a single person, whether a protective spouse or a concerned physician, decide the fate of the American executive branch in secret. The story of Woodrow Wilson's stroke is not merely a tale of illness and political betrayal. It is a powerful reminder of how a quiet moment of physical tragedy, concealed behind the walls of the White House, can expose the fundamental weaknesses in the structure of a republic, weaknesses that require decades of political will to finally repair.